All right.
We hear you.
Can you see that fabulous looking aircraft there?
Yeah.
I'm waving to you from about the third or fourth window along. Can you see me?
Nah. I do.
So for those of you who have not met, it's a pleasure to meet you electronically or virtually, and it's unfortunate that I was not able to be there in person today, particularly after I was promised kolaches, which I'm particularly keen on. I hope they were good.
Yummy. Sausage and ham and cheese.
Dang. Oh well, next time. So as you can probably tell, I'm not from Houston originally. I grew up in Far East Texas, about 5,000 miles east of Houston, in Scotland. I'm an engineer by education. Don't hold that against me. I've had two separate careers. My first career was in multiple disciplines in an oil and gas company, and then about 22 or 23 years ago, I jumped the fence and became a consultant in project management and risk management. I've been doing that ever since. Oh, great. The flipping yard crew has shown up here. Hopefully you can't hear all that.
Nice and quiet.
Okay, they'll get noisier. I'll just have to talk louder. So the company I'm with now, vPSI Group, I co-founded in almost 20 years ago. I think next year is our 20th year. And we've been doing risk management and project management consulting through that vehicle ever since, really. And we do a broad range of different services, all the way from process safety, IH, and we specialize in making sure organizations actually learn something when something goes wrong. So if you all think you're good at incident investigations, I'm here to tell you that you're not, and we can measure it. But not everyone's willing to listen to that message. Let's see. Oh, the ASSP foolishly named me as Safety Professional of the Year for the Gulf Coast region, for Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas last year. So I guess even though I'm just a troublemaker, somebody must appreciate what I do. That's deeply honored by that. And speaking of ASSP, if any of y'all are going to Austin in a couple of weeks, we have our booth there. It'd be great to see you, swing by and visit, and help us while away the dreary days of manning the booth. Anyway, on to the presentation here. So we've got a small group today, and that means that we can be interactive. If anybody has any points they want to make, any questions they want to ask, anything they want to argue about, then by all means jump in, and we can have this be a kind of a two-way discussion rather than just me droning on in the corner of your screens here. So the idea behind this presentation is kind of to reassure everybody. One of the things that we see folks worrying about in the HSE world is, are they doing the right stuff, and are they failing to be what the rest of the world expects them to be? And this is particularly a struggle right now because there are so many almost conflicting philosophies around HSE, and the big argument, for example, about safety differently and safety two versus traditional safety, and so on and so forth. And to add to the mix, we now have this concept of HRO, the high reliability organization, which is almost designed to make you feel inadequate. It basically, as it's presented traditionally, it's presented as you ought to never get anything wrong. if you've designed your processes and management systems appropriately. And so the purpose of this presentation is to make you feel less inadequate. When you start to have people come at you with this HRO stuff, I'm going to arm you with some kind of defensive mechanisms here. And that's where the subtitle of this presentation comes from. Has an airline ever lost your luggage? And so I'll explain that as we get into it. So HRO versus HRO, has an airline ever lost your luggage? So jumping into the worst possible slide here, a very busy slide with lots of bullet points on it. This is how high reliability organization, or HRO, is defined. This particular definition comes from the United Kingdom's Health and Safety Executive, who are really up on this stuff. And there are various other definitions out there, but this is probably the most brief and to the point. The idea behind the high reliability organization is six-pointed, essentially, where it's the anticipation and containment through defensive mechanisms, or redundancy, or consequence management, competence rather than just training, and then learning from stuff that does go wrong. Those of you I've met in the past have probably heard me ranting and raving about the ridiculous concept of root cause analysis, and you'll see that I've scratched through root cause. That's just a philosophical difference I have with the rest of the world, that there's actually no such thing as a root cause, and that we delude ourselves when we use that kind of language. It often leads us very, very badly astray. Anything that you call a root cause, I can still ask why, which means it's not the root cause. It means it's the effect of some other cause, and that basically can be pursued infinitely, or ad infinitum, to throw some Latin in, although it's very early in the day for Latin. Other things that you're expected to have in an HRO, as it's defined here. The idea of a just culture where folks are not in any way intimidated, where people are ready to report deviations, where they're ready to report problems, where they're ready to stop work, or and we see different expressions of that now. The stop work authority in some organizations has now been described as the stop work obligation. And then a relatively new development is a thing called start work authority, which is kind of a more positive spin on the whole idea of the ability to just grind things to a halt if people are uncomfortable. And then there's a whole bunch of the usual stuff about leadership, because of course the leadership always sets the tone. People do the things that they think their leadership cares about, and this is why we're still battling the foolish notion of TRIR, because the leadership in our organizations generally get their bonuses based on TRIR, despite its lack of value as an actual performance metric. So when people do come, the folks who are going to try and sell you on HRO stuff, they're going to be retired fighter pilots, or SEALs, or some kind of upscale military or former military dudes. And they have great stories to tell, and it's very distracting. But the examples that are most often put forward of an HRO are things like commercial aviation, particularly aircraft carrier flight decks. That's a tremendous example that's very often put forward. And then the world of nuclear power generation. And so I'm going to take these examples, and we're going to discuss a little bit why we should not be intimidated by these ideas of high reliability organizations, and why you probably don't need to operate your entire organization like an aircraft carrier flight deck. So let's try and decide if we are already as HRO as we need to be in our organizations. So let's initially look at commercial aviation. So again, I'm waving to you from the fourth window along on the left. Now here's a useless piece of knowledge for you. I don't know if you've ever heard the expression POSH, P-O-S-H. And so I apply the POSH principle when I'm flying, especially when I'm flying internationally. And POSH actually stands for port out, starboard home. And it dates back from the days of the British Empire when folks were sailing out to India and Ceylon and so forth. And it was actually more expensive to have a cabin on the left-hand side of a boat going out to the Far East because it's cooler. The sun shines on the starboard side of the boat on the way out, and it's more expensive to have a starboard cabin, a right-hand cabin on the way back, because the sun is going to be shining on the left-hand side of the boat, and hence sort of port out, starboard home. So when you're thinking about a long-haul flight, think about that POSH principle and make your seat selection appropriately. I'm a big fan of sitting by the window. I know most people prefer the aisle, but I like looking out the window at the clouds going by. Anyway, so here's an example of a Norman trip. So Norman gets on the plane and he's actually heading for South Africa. And so that involves a happy Norman flying to London with his luggage here, and gets to London, sits around in the airport for a while in London, gets on a plane and flies on down to Johannesburg. Unfortunately, Norman is not happy anymore. Why is Norman not happy? Well, because Norman has discovered that his luggage went to Estonia. Now, I have to ask you this: is this the behavior of a high reliability organization? Is this the behavior of an organization that meets all the criteria of that definition that we talked about previously? The answer is clearly no. And another example of that would be if we look at, say, these other operations that surround the airplane full of people getting from A to B. You don't want to be this guy. You don't want to be this guy. You don't want to be this guy. And you certainly don't want to be either of these guys. Statistics on the injuries to these kind of folks are actually quite obscure and difficult to get your hands on. It turns out that some of this information is kind of, what's the word? Not hidden exactly, but it's behind a veil, some of it protected by, if you will, Homeland Security concerns. But see, here are some statistics that I managed to dig up. They're a little bit old, but I'm sure they're still as valid now. This is an organization that compiles this data. Unfortunately, the Airports Council International, ACI, charge many thousands of dollars to have access to this sort of information. And frankly, I'm Scottish and we're very careful with our money. So there's absolutely no way I'm going to be paying thousands of dollars for this. But anyway, this is the most recent stuff I could find free. And it dates back from 2007, but not much has changed really on the ramp since then. So out of these 158 airports that are reported into this data set, check this out, hundreds and thousands of injuries just in these 158 airports. Quite eye-opening, really. You don't want to be these guys. You don't want to be out on the ramp, handling luggage, high traffic, fast moving, so on and so forth. Wow. So is this the behavior of a high reliability organization? Well, let's look at the aircraft carrier flight deck now. So here, look at this. Look at the choreography involved in these, getting these multi-million-dollar jets off of this thing and getting them back and so on and so forth. Isn't that absolutely fabulous? Well, again, statistics on this sort of stuff, quite hard to find. But here's some info from a couple of aircraft carriers that were. This is a sort of an internal military study that was released through the Journal of Military Medicine. Wow, busy. Hospitals on these ships are very busy. Check it out. Lots of people getting banged up in various different ways. And a fairly high proportion of these are in the air operations. Is this the kind of output you would expect from a high reliability organization? Okay, well, let's look at nuclear now. And this is actually some work we did in the Canadian nuclear power generating world inspired some of the thinking behind this presentation. And as you can see here, this is not Canadian, but there's a surprising amount of nonsense going on in the world of nuclear power. When we first started working in the Canadian nuclear power generation world, which I didn't even know existed until we got there, really. This is the kind of stuff that we found ourselves looking at. People banging each other with tools, driving forklifts into walls, falling off of scaffold, things breaking, cranes failing. That sounds like just about everywhere else, doesn't it? That sounds like a very kind of normal operation. Just lots and lots of minor little things going on. So wait a minute, is nuclear actually a high reliability organization? Because you would hope that, what the heck is going on here? There's tons of this stuff. But what's fascinating to me is that in this world of nuclear, they actually had an enormous amount of procedural friction going on in the organization. Absolutely spectacular. The bureaucracy was completely, I can't even describe it other than with a picture. So don't try to read this, but just see the basics of what's going on here. At the top left-hand corner, there's a door they can't close because there's a hose going through the door. Now, the good news is that by the bottom right-hand corner, the door is closed and the hose is nowhere to be seen. But can you see all of the BS that has to be gone through in this organization to get from the top left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner? It's absolutely spectacular. Even the most minor problem has to go through this process. How many meetings are there on this process? How many reports are there on this process? How many people are involved in managing the way through this process? Isn't that interesting? Do you think this is taking it too far? Because also we can see from the previous slide, it's not actually preventing all of the stuff going wrong that you might think it should prevent. And just to make it even more interesting, this particular organization has more than one of these processes. Here's a different one. Now, I can't tell you what the difference is between going into the SCO process and the ACER process, But this one is just about as bad. Do you think this slows things down in the organization? Do you think this level of bureaucracy undercuts reporting? Do you think it dissuades people from bringing issues and opportunities for improvement to the surface? Do you think that it is expensive? Do you think that it erodes margin? Do you think that it does much useful? This is the downside of trying to be a high reliability organization. That in order to think of yourselves as such, it actually is going to require an enormous amount of frictional bureaucracy in the organization that's going to have cost associated with it and may actually not have the effect that you desire. So there's a kind of pragmatism required here. Pragmatism is one of my all-time favorite words, because what it means is that we have to take the theory and think about how we can optimize that theory for a benefit that's actually worth having at a cost that's worth incurring. And so in order to approach the pragmatism that we really ought to have within our own businesses, we have to stop thinking about HRO as being about being a high reliability organization, and instead think of it in terms of high reliability operations within the organization as a whole. Not thinking in terms of the entire organization having to meet the criteria of a high reliability entity, but to think about the things that we do in the organization that we want to be or need to have as high reliability. And that can be thought of from a risk perspective. So let's think about risk. Risk traditionally represented in a matrix where we're considering combinations of probabilities and outcomes. And generally they're traffic light colored, where red means no, yellow means oh, and green means go. So no, oh, and go. Now, what we can think of philosophically here is that the line between the green and the yellow can actually be thought of as representing the organization's risk tolerance, meaning that the organization is okay with the level of risk that's below and to the left of this line that's traditionally colored green. Now, this is kind of a reversal of normal thinking about a risk matrix, but what we're actually looking at here in this green area is a population of incidents that the organization has said that it's okay with. One thing that I can suggest to you is to go look at your organization's risk matrix and look at the stuff that's in the green and look at the worst outcome that's in the green. What is in that box that's sticking up at the left-hand side of the green area there? And in many organizations, it's a single fatality. Wait, what? The organization's okay with somebody being killed? That's absolutely outrageous. You can't say that. I don't need to say it though, because most organizations have already said it. Now, what it does, the response to that is often, well, but we've decided that it's an extremely unlikely event. And my retort to that is, yeah, but unlikely doesn't mean won't happen. It just means you're allowed to be surprised if it does happen. It's a bit like low probability events happen all the time. People get struck by lightning. That's very unlikely, but it happens all the time. It's very unlikely that you'll win the lottery, but people do all the time. It's an interesting challenge, but then we almost have to have that in the green. Otherwise, we would never be able to have people driving company vehicles. If you think about it, the probability of one of your folks being killed in a car wreck is low, but it does happen. And you can't say that driving a vehicle, the residual risk of driving a vehicle is anything other than green. Otherwise, you're never going to get anything done. Anyway, there's an interesting phenomenon though, which is that when we do a risk assessment looking ahead at a particular activity, even though there's a remote chance of somebody being killed doing it or seriously injured, we may place it in the green and say, okay, go. However, should that unlikely outcome be actualized, should it actually happen, the organization will go completely nuts. And that's understandable from the kind of human and group dynamics perspective. But it's interesting because it reveals, in a sense, a form of corporate schizophrenia. That we're all right with a risk looking forward, but we're not okay if that risk is actualized. Anyway, when we expand on this thinking a little bit, what we find is that we are essentially saying that the stuff outside of this dividing line between the green and the yellow matters to us. It's significant. It's something that we care about. And the stuff within the green, we've essentially denoted as non-significant, and we somewhat care less about that. And so we can translate this from the flat matrix, if you will, into this more three-dimensional shape here, making the red here a sort of plug in the whole of our toroid. And what this is essentially saying is that we have a chunk of risk that we're unhappy about, that we want to manage to the max. And then we have this other thing, which I call the donut of chaos, which is the other stuff that we don't really care as much about from a risk perspective. And that does not need to be a high reliability operation. So we're now segmenting our activities into stuff that we want to be high reliability from a risk perspective and stuff that doesn't need to be high reliability from a risk perspective. And the benefit of doing this is one of ease of operation. It's about optimizing bureaucracy, optimizing control, and reducing bureaucratic friction, reducing cost to a point that is the term is as low as reasonably practical, meaning that we've done what we need to do to take the risk to a point where we accept it. And so in commercial aviation, getting a plane load of Normans from one place to another, that's a high reliability operation. That's an operation where the risk involved is in the red, and therefore it's managed to the max. In the aircraft carrier flight deck, we're talking about getting millions and millions of our tax dollars worth of aircraft off and on the boat, and that's a high reliability operation. And in nuclear power generation, certainly reactor control and containment is a high reliability operation. And each of these three examples are surrounded by donuts of chaos, where there's all kinds of standard nonsense going on, as I described previously. And so the question that you need to address in your organizations are, what are your high reliability operations? What are the operations, what are the activities within your organization that need to be high reliability? So for example, if you're in construction support, crane operations are probably something that you want to have as high reliability. deep trenching, you want that to be high reliability. What do you think? Do you have high reliability operations within the organization as it's currently running? So in connection with this, I'm going to join two things together here. One of the other trendy things in safety right now is HOP, HOP, Human and Organizational Performance, and it actually links to HRO in a very significant way. And that's because over the years, the time axis of this chart is 40 years or 50 years or what have you. And over that time, using traditional metrics, you can instead of risk on the vertical axis here, you can put TRI and so on. You can put any metric you like. But over this long period of time, the workplace has become generally a safer place to be. When I kicked off in oil and gas in the mid-1980s, which was a terrible time to start in oil and gas, by the way. It was one of the first downturns. They had taken all the booze off the corporate jet, which was an absolute disaster as far as we were concerned. But back in those days, there was almost an expectation that at some point you'd be hurt on the job. But things have improved thanks to the efforts of organizations and the likes of Jim and OSHA and so on. The workplace risk has improved, has got lower and lower and lower, to a point now where in many organizations it's approaching this alarm level of as low as reasonably practical. Now that doesn't mean that no one's getting hurt. It doesn't mean that nothing's getting broken. It just means that reducing the risk further is actually going to be quite tough. So it's job security for HSE people, in fact. Anyway, how have we got here? Well, there's been all sorts of improvement in plant and process and equipment and management systems and so on and so forth. Things like startup safety reviews, job safety analysis, risk assessments, and so on and so forth. The automation, guarding, machinery guarding, and so on and so on. And we've got ourselves to this situation where it's actually legitimate for folks to show up in a workplace and expect to go home every day. There are people in the workplace joining the workforce now who are walking into a context which is actually about as risk-free as it can be, practically speaking. But people still get hurt. Folks still are getting injured, stuff still getting broken, and that's because now we're having to worry about the people who are being human in the workplace that's been provided for them. And there are now more and more data sets coming out. There was an interesting debate on LinkedIn recently trying to list all of the folks who've now decided that about 80% or in that area of unplanned events have a human performance cause associated with them, rather than a management system or an equipment or plant or things like that type cause. And here's a particular, this is lifted from the International Oil and Gas Producers Report 453, which came out last year. They looked at the incidents reported by their member companies and discovered that 80% of those incidents had a human performance. They labeled it human error, but it's essentially a human performance cause. And of those, about 3/4 were some kind of organizational weakness, and 30% of those were what might be called individual errors, which is kind of interesting because it's saying that the work context that has been designed is in most cases adequate to get the job done without anything going wrong, and yet stuff still does. So organizational weaknesses are things like undermanning, failure to provide the right equipment, equipment not working properly, and so on and so forth. And in that respect, there can be a management system, or obviously there are background causes there, but they have provoked human performance problems. And so if you're going to try and combine HRO with HOP, and I apologize for all of these acronyms, if you're going to combine trying to be high reliability, have high reliability operations within your organization, you're going to have to consider the human organizational performance stuff. So you're going to have to consider the human frailty that the folks in your business bring to the workplace just naturally. And so here's a tool that some of you have probably encountered, the HAZOP in the past. This is very much like HAZOP as a process, but instead of looking at a physical system such as a separator or a pipeline or a compressor or some such thing like that, what we actually would do is look at the steps in an activity, the procedural steps in an activity that you want to have as a high reliability operation, and we'd run stepwise through this process to determine what needs to be done to make it high reliability in terms of the exposure you have due to having humans actually executing this particular piece of work. So it's super straightforward, but I'll run through it anyway and see what y'all think. So the first thing, obviously, is to break the activity down into coherent steps, and many folks have already done this in a stepwise JSA. So this part is generally fairly well documented already. But then the next step is to look at how much successful completion of that step depends on human involvement. Whether it's all about a human getting it right, or whether it's not as dependent on. So an example would be, okay, you have 10 valves that need to be lined up in a particular way to have the process run the way that you want it to run. Is that automated? Do you push a button in the control room and boing, all 10 valves are lined up? Or do you have to send an operator out there to do it, all 10 valves, or 8 of them remote control and 2 of them are manual, and so on? So that's an example of ascertaining the level of human intervention required to get the job done successfully. Now, for each of those required human successes, you would look for opportunities for their humanity to get in the way of them being successful. And the 4 classifications of human performance problem that we would recommend come from Energy Institute, which is one of the organizations that's very big into this human performance stuff. They're based in Europe, but all of their stuff is accessible free, and I've already told you how much I like free. Anyway, so they talk about 4 flavors of human performance failure, which are slip, lapse, mistake, and violation. Slip and a lapse are the inevitable consequence of being human. Moments of forgetfulness, moments of inattention, which we all do. There's a great deal of research in this area, and the consensus is that each individual, just by virtue of their humanity, will have between 5 and 10 slips and lapses per hour. Now, that gets a bit scary when you start to think about a large workforce. If you think about you've got 1,000 people in your operation, and that means there are between 5 and 10,000 slips and lapses going on every hour. I'm an engineer, so I'm not very good at math, but if you start looking at that on an annual basis, you begin to see an enormous amount of exposure from the people that you have out there just being human and having these sort of brain farts. So that's a big deal, and these slips and lapses are perpetrated by everybody. So your most experienced, your best trained, your most well rested, your happiest, your best people are still having between 5 and 10 slips and lapses per hour. And most of them don't amount to anything. But in the context of this analysis, you're going to look for places where they would have a negative impact that you care about. And then we're going to put those onto a risk matrix, like we looked at before, where we are going to say, okay, we can't have this. It's absolutely in the red, or we're kind of okay with this, but let's think about whether it's worth a bit more detailed risk management, stick it in the yellow, and then say, you know what, the system here is designed to fail safely or fail softly, and so we can actually live with it. And then the next step is to look at the ones that you've decided need to be managed in more detail. And you can start to look at things like the management of knowledge, skills, and ability, competency, which apply into the mistake classification of the human performance, manning levels, engineering, controls, and so on and so forth. And then look at how you have transitioned that risk from a red to a yellow or to a green, depending on where you think it ought to live. And then if you're smart about it, you're going to validate some kind of effectiveness. You're going to do some kind of effectiveness validation on what you've come up with. And this is the only thing. This is kind of a sales pitch, and I'm not going to say anything about it, but we can do that. And then obviously you have to maintain that and do a plan, do you act, a revised type loop on it to make sure that you're actually getting the value out of it that you thought. And so when you've done all that with the activities that you have decided need to be high reliability operations, you are as HRO as you need to be. And so that's the conclusion really, is that in most cases you will find when you look at your operations in detail, you're already as HRO as you need to be. And don't be intimidated by all these fighter pilots and so forth coming in and telling you that you're not good enough, because in most organizations, just through traditional risk management, you've actually done a very decent job of this already, and you're probably, I'm going to say this again, you're as HRO as you need to be. So high reliability operation rather than high reliability organization. Now, if you're interested in digging into this more deeply, particularly if you're interested in looking at the traditional thinking on an HRO, there are a couple of references here, which again are free, and you can find them on the interwebs and have a look at this stuff. Do your own research, and if you want any more, then I'm obviously very happy to talk about this. Ask me questions, link up on LinkedIn, tweet at me. Don't bother with Facebook. But that's all I had for this morning. So if anyone has any questions or comments, then this is a great time to have a little discussion about it.